Get all this turned on. All right. I remember hearing about a guy that was standing in the checkout line in a store, and one of the customers was paying with a check. So the cashier, of course, had to get it okayed by the manager. She waved the paper in the air and said, "I need approval." And the cashier at the next register said, "Your hair looks nice today." Now that obviously wasn't the kind of approval that she was looking for. However, we all go through times when we feel like we need the approval of others. When I first surrendered to the ministry, my youth minister, who at that point was actually the associate pastor at the church as well. Excuse me, just a second. My Mucinex is running off. But I had gone to him and told him that I really felt like God was calling me into the ministry. And he asked me if I thought that I could do anything else in life and be happy. Well, since I'd been working for the Wichita Park Department for about 5 years up to that point, I knew what the answer was. And I told him no, that going into the ministry was the only way that I could see myself being truly happy. And he said, "Okay, remember that. Because working in the church can be the most rewarding and the most heartbreaking and painful work that you can ever do as a calling." And my response to him was, "Okay." Because I really didn't understand what it was that he was talking about. I mean, who wouldn't love this guy? Right? Okay, now I feel like JR. That wasn't that funny. But it wasn't long before I found out that really wasn't the case. There were people who thought that I was too loud. There were people who didn't like some of the songs that I picked. There were people who didn't like what I was teaching youth at that point. I even had somebody who didn't like the fact that I didn't sing every verse of every hymn. And then I came across this verse, and it changed the way I thought about myself in ministry. It's in Galatians chapter 1, if you want to turn there. Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. Galatians 1:10. It says this, "For am I now striving to find favor?" No, let me start again. "For am I now trying to win the favor of people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a slave of Christ." This verse not only helped me settle a few things, but I think this verse could help every believer to settle some things in their lives as well. We just need to ask ourselves, who am I trying to impress? Whose applause do I need? Now, we all know the correct answer. We need God's applause. We need God's approval and no one else's. And it's easy to say that I live only for God's approval and no one else's. But it's not so easy to do. I think one of the reasons why we often need approval from others is because we don't fully approve of ourselves. There are a lot of people who simply don't like themselves. And when you don't like yourself, you tend to look to others for approval. The problem is that others' approval is never enough, because not everybody is going to like you as much as you need them to like you. I heard a comedian say one time that he could be speaking in front of a packed audience and everybody's laughing, or almost everyone. And he'll notice that one person with a frown on their face. And it doesn't just notice the guy, but he starts to obsess about it. Even after the show, he said he kept asking himself, what's wrong with me? Why didn't that person like me? Now, since you and I have some emotional distance from that situation, we can hear about this comedian's insecurities and we say, well, that's crazy. Maybe the guy isn't laughing because he has a headache. Maybe he just had a fight with his wife. Maybe he just doesn't know what funny is. Why can't you just enjoy the fact that everyone else thinks you're great? Don't worry about the one person who didn't enjoy the show. And that's very easy to say when you're talking about somebody else. However, when it's you that's in the middle of it, it's a different situation. 2 weeks ago, we looked at how you've been pre-approved by God. He chose you to be His. He chose you to be blessed. He chose you to be good. And He's given you everything that you need to make that happen. Last week, we talked about how to live up to the name that God has given us. Not how to earn His acceptance or earn His love, but how to live up to the love and the acceptance that we've already received. How do you do that? Well, you do it by becoming a student of the Word. You train yourself to become a workman so that your life can become a payback, if you will, for all that God has given you. This week, I want to take a look at self-approval. Overcoming the need for approval from others and learning how to pass your own mirror test. Okay, so what exactly is a mirror test? Well, that's the test that you take when you look in the mirror and you decide whether or not you like the person who's looking back at you. If you don't feel good about that person, you're probably going to spend the rest of your life trying to compensate in one way or another. Maybe you'll compensate by looking for love in all the wrong places, as the song used to go. Maybe you'll compensate by finding escape in alcohol. Maybe you compensate by trying to make everybody like you, by trying to be the life of the party. Maybe you compensate by bragging about yourself. Maybe you compensate by putting others down. There are all kinds of ways that we try to manipulate ourselves into forgetting that we're not satisfied with the person who's looking back at us in the mirror. The problem is that none of these things work. The truth of the matter is that there's one thing that everybody in this room has in common: sin. We are all sinners. We all have a past. Not just you, but the person sitting next to you, and the person behind you, and the person in front of you. Except for those of you who don't have anybody sitting in front of you, then the person in front of you is a pretty good guy. But we've all been separated from God by sin. We've all made foolish choices and destructive decisions. We all could, with just a little bit of introspection, build a case against ourselves. This is why I'm a bad person. This is why I'm never going to pass the mirror test. Well, no matter what your past is like, today you can begin to pass the mirror test. Not by lying to yourself, not by lying about yourself, not by fooling everybody around you. You pass the mirror test by surrendering yourself to the grace of God. So today I want to take a few minutes to talk about the steps that you might need to take in order to get there. If you're not completely comfortable with who you are, if guilt and shame and regret are still dogging you and dragging you down, then these steps, I think, will help you. The first thing is you need to decide whose opinion really matters most. Look at that verse that we looked at again. The first half of it, Galatians 1:10. Paul said this, For am I now trying to win the favor of people or God? Or am I striving to please people? Striving to please men or striving to impress people can't lead us where we need to go. In fact, when we do that, it generally leads us to do a bunch of crazy stuff. I knew a man in his 30s who bought a car, among other things, that he couldn't afford because he wanted his in-laws to think that he was doing better financially than he actually was. And then he was left trying to juggle money that he didn't have just so that his in-laws would approve of him. I've also seen this desire to win the approval of others take a little more sinful turn. When I worked for the park department, and then when I worked for the lobbyist that I did in Kansas, I saw people at work give in to the hive mind. And when I say that, they participated in vulgar conversations and made racist and sexist kind of remarks just so that they'd be identified as being one of the group, one of the folks that they were with. The problem is that when you compromise your integrity in this way, just so that people will accept you, you have a hard time afterward accepting yourself. So today I want to encourage you to separate yourself from the hive. Get some distance between yourself and those whose approval you think you need. Take some time to think about whose opinion really matters most. Who do you need to impress? Whose approval do you have to earn? As long as there's a name on that list other than the name of Jesus, you're going to have a hard time passing the mirror test. As long as you feel dependent upon the approval of somebody else, you're always going to be at risk of compromising your commitment to God. And here's the second thing that we need to consider. You need to decide whose forgiveness really matters most. Jesus said in Matthew 5, verses 23 and 24, So if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Now, let's say you do that. You've gone to someone to seek forgiveness for what you've done, and you've tried to make amends. You've tried to reconcile and make up to that person the wrong that you did. And they don't want to forgive you. Let's say you've repented and sought forgiveness from God, and you believe that God has forgiven you. You've apologized and asked forgiveness of those that you've hurt, but they want nothing to do with forgiving you. Maybe it's because the damage that was done is irreparable. Maybe there's no way to make up for what was done. There's no restitution that will come close to undoing the damage. And you may even understand their feelings. Because if someone were to do to you what they perceive that you did to them, you might find it hard to forgive them as well. It shows us that we need to understand the gravity of the things that we do. But there's a greater point here that we need to grasp. God's forgiveness trumps everyone else's. God's forgiveness matters more than anything else in the world. Now, I want to make this clear. If you've sinned against another person, if you've created some kind of a painful situation for them, then you need to ask them for forgiveness. And if you've made a mess that's in your power to clean up, then you need to clean it up. And if the person you sinned against forgives you, great. But what if they don't forgive you? Maybe they're going to hold it against you for as long as they live. When that happens, what can you do? If you've asked forgiveness, if you've taken the steps to reconcile, if you've done all that you can to make things right, and they're not ready yet, or able yet, or willing yet to forgive you, then you need to decide for yourself whose forgiveness matters most to you. God forgives you even when you don't deserve to be forgiven. He forgives you even when everyone else refuses to forgive you. He forgives you even when the mess you've made is so complicated that you can never make it right. We can never give anyone God's place in our lives. No matter how wrong you may have been before, no matter how right they were to be offended, don't give anyone God's place in your life. God has forgiven you. Jesus Christ came into this world and died a violent death at the hands of his enemies. And while he hung upon the cross, all the sins of the world, including yours, were placed on him. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. God has forgiven you. He had a debt, or you had a debt, that you couldn't pay, and he paid the debt that he didn't owe. And his forgiveness matters more than anything else in the world. There are people in this world who won't forgive you for your big sins. Chances are they may not even forgive you for your little sins. Maybe they won't forgive you for even the slightest slight that you may have inadvertently committed. But once you've made a good faith effort to make things right, the only thing left to do is to let it go. Embrace God's forgiveness. He's the one whose forgiveness matters more than anyone else's. There's one more thing that I want us to see. And then we need to decide whose purpose for your life really matters most. Decide whose purpose for your life really matters most. Go back to Galatians 1, verse 10. We're going to look at the last half of that verse now. It says, if I were still trying to please people, I would not be a slave of Christ. I think you might even be able to say, if I were still trying to please people, I could not be a slave of Christ. Because Jesus very simply said that you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and money, and you can't live to please God and live to please other people. There's an old joke about a preacher who wanted to do his job well. So he kept one eye on the Lord and one eye on the deacon board. And the two were so far away from one another that the preacher's eyes eventually ended up on the back of his head. The mirror test every morning is not a dad test. You're not asking yourself, am I doing everything my dad wants me to do? It's not a country club test. You're not asking yourself, will the direction my life is taking impress the folks at the club, or the pub or the cafe, wherever it is that you like to hang out. It's not even the spouse test. You're not asking, will my husband or wife give me permission to put God first in my life? The mirror test is a God test. The mirror test is the moment in which you take a long look at yourself and you say, God, you are my top priority. Being right with you matters more than anything. Living for you today is my main objective. Passing the mirror test means that you embrace the grace that God has for you in that moment. You let go of the past. You let go of what others may think of you. You let go of what you might even think of yourself. And you surrender yourself to God's presence in your life. And for me, I generally don't have that much of a problem with getting over folks who don't want to forgive me if I've wronged somebody. If they don't want to forgive me, I can generally get over that pretty quickly. The problem I have is forgiving myself for the things that I've done. And that's the hardest for me. We sometimes forget that Paul himself had a past to deal with. Before he became a Christian, he committed murder. He became a Christian, and then he began to struggle with his sinful nature to the point of despair, to the point of saying that he was the chief of sinners, to the point of saying, "Oh, what a wretched man am I." He suffered through a great deal of conflict in his ministry. And there were more than a few people in the church who really didn't like Paul. But here's what he said in one of his letters. 1 Corinthians 4, verses 3 and 4. "It is of little importance to me that I should be evaluated by you or any human court. In fact, I don't even evaluate myself, for I am not conscious of anything against myself, but I am not justified by this. The one who evaluates me is the Lord." And that's where we need to be. To the point where we can say, I'm not going to let you judge me, and I'm not going to let me judge me. I surrender myself to the mercy of God because He is the only one to judge. There's no way that you can be honest with yourself about who you are and what you've done and still pass the mirror test unless you know the grace of God. Without the grace of God, the past never lets you go. But the Bible says that God has taken the misdeeds of the past and dumped them into a sea of forgetfulness. It's gone. All that remains is today. So when you look in the mirror, what do you see? My hope is that you will see a man or a woman who's determined to live in the presence of God. My hope is that you will see yourself as chosen of God and cherished by Him. My hope is that you will see yourself the scars of yesterday and realize that those scars are all that remain of the past that God has washed clean. That He's chosen to forgive you once and for all, now and forever. My hope is that when you look in the mirror, you'll see yourself surrendered to God, His servant, His bondservant, eager to do what He asks of you. My hope is that as you pass the mirror test, you'll realize that you didn't get there on your own. It's God's grace that makes this day your day. So to pass the mirror test, today, tomorrow, the next day, and the next, what you have to do at the beginning of each day is embrace God's grace and seek His face. And here's the paradox. Being okay with who you are doesn't come down to what you think of yourself. It comes down to what you choose to believe about yourself based on what God has said about you. And God has said, you are chosen. You are my cherished child. You are forgiven. And you are my servant. So don't listen to the world. Don't listen to the devil. Don't listen to your enemies. Don't even listen to your own lying heart. Listen to what God says. You can't undo yesterday. But today, you can embrace God's grace and seek His face. Take out your prayer sheets, if you would.